It's time for the live poetry reading. Actually, today we're not going to do live poetry reading. I recently wrote a 1,000th poem, so I thought I would do a special presentation, show you the poems I've done, what I'm working on now, what collections, and talk about the future goal and also share some of my favorite poets, my connection with them, or what connected me to like them. I'll show you the presentation now. So first let's take a look outside and see it's a nice, bright, sunny day. We can look out the window there. Nice day in China. So I'm Samuel Gurman, US poet, and like I said, I just wrote my 1,000th poem. So here's a look at the couple of collections I've done. So I completed my first collection and published in 2018, Treasures of Life. And then the next one was actually this year, Nightmares, Dreams, and Hallucinations. And I also published a fantasy book, The Legend of Trollbanus, but of course that's not poetry or poems. So I've completed 4 other collections, but they haven't been published yet. So in the future I'll slowly be publishing these. But we have Be Someone, Become Something, Grace Anatomy, The Ghost of McLean Forest, and The Marketplace. So you just talk really quickly about some of those collections. So Be Someone, Become Something is a collection of quotes from famous people, and then a couple quotes that I created myself. And then I turned them into poems. So I finished that collection, and it ended up being 157 poems. And then I was doing live readings for this poetry collection, and I recently finished it. It's called Grace Anatomy. That's poems about the human anatomy, exploring it and learning about it. Oh, I forgot to say how many poems we have in Grace Anatomy. We have 65. Ghost of McLean Forest, 127 poems. I worked at a summer camp for 3 years that was supposedly haunted, and so I wrote poems talking about the people, the camp, and the ghosts. And I just changed the name of the camp. I changed the name of the people, so no one will know what it is. And then I have The Market, 86 poems. These are poems about different things you can buy at the market. Fruit, vegetables, meat, basically food, things you can eat. And then I have the Free Write poems, 213. They're just about anything. I like to have one day where I just can not have a specific collection I'm working on, but anything on my mind or any story I want to tell, I can do that. And then these are the collections I'm working on right now. So I have Better to Be Punny Than Puny. I'm actually doing live readings for that on Tuesday, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that's just dad jokes, silly rhymes, play on words, puns. And I have the fantasy story, Uda, and I'm also reading that Wednesday, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Poetic Manifesto. But some of those poems are a little controversial, so I'm actually not reading them, but I will eventually publish the collection. But just reading it on TikTok, it could be taken out of context or easily trigger someone. So I've decided not to read those. And now I have a fantasy story being plotted. Eventually it'll be turned into poems. It's called The Nasty Cats of Whitestone Alley. And that also has a little bit of political things, but it's a bit playful. So when I start writing that, I will do live readings for that. And I began writing poetry at UAF, which if you've never heard of that, it's University of Alaska, Fairbanks. And in that class, I wrote 12 poems, but I no longer have copies of them, so I don't count them in the 1,000. And then after that, I didn't write poems for a while, and I had a girlfriend. I wrote 7 poems for her. I include those poems. And this is the 1,000th poem. It was written last week for the Uda fantasy story. It was the 84th poem of that collection called The Plan. And that fantasy stories, we're getting towards the end, probably have about 20 poems left there. And so the goal is 6,000. The big goal. Of course, each time I reach another 1,000, I'll do a video about it. And let's see some of the poets who have written a lot of poems. So the first one I found is Emily Dickinson. So she's an American poet, and she wrote 1,700 poems. 10 of them were published while she was alive. And today there is even an HBO series about her. And then maybe the most financially successful poet is Shakespeare. He had 2.4 billion book sales. He wrote 154 sonnets, 2 long narrative poems, 38 plays, and an unknown number of poems. And then we have John Bradburn. So he wrote 6,000 poems and almost 170,000 lines of poetry. And then we have Kanada-san, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he also wrote 6,000 poems. In addition to that, he wrote 5,000 lyrics for songs, and he published 232 books. So that's, of course, why I picked the number 6,000. I'd like to tie the record for most poems ever written. And so now I'd like to talk about poets I like, and then just tell something really quickly about them, and then what connected me to them, why I like them. So the first one here is Charles Bukowski. So he was a rigid person. He had a rough life. If you read some of his books or check out his biography, you can learn about that. But even though he had a tough life, he managed to make something of his life through poetry and writing. His poems are often stories and experiences. They lack prose, but they're very compelling. They're very entertaining. And a lot of times I like to write poems like that too, with just telling a story, just telling an experience, rather than focusing on making a prose, beautiful poem. It can be beautiful in a different way. The next guy here is Lord Byron, or not guy, but poet. And he's not as famous, but he was known for traveling and writing poetry, living for adventure, and learning about other cultures. And of course, I've now lived in 5 different countries, and I do a similar thing, traveling and writing poetry, living for adventure. But what kind of adventures did he do? He went to Turkish baths. He had relations with an Albanian warlord, and he was part of a Greek revolt. And this guy is originally from England, if you didn't know. Of course, I actually went to a Turkish bath, but I didn't have relations with Albanian warlord or wasn't involved in Greek revolt yet. So, who's next? Walt Whitman. He's, of course, very famous. A famous American poet. And he's known as the father of free verse. And I think he looks like Gandalf, so that's also a plus. I also write a lot of free verse. And when you read his poems, he lacks, the rules of poetry. He lacks sometimes meter or, planned meter, prose. But his poems are still very beautiful and very powerful. And so that can teach you using free verse isn't necessarily going to make your poems bad or unattractive. And then we have Sylvia Plath. So she's mostly known for death and dark, depressing style poetry. So I also have some dark poems. I wrote one called Sweet Death, and I actually got an illustration done. It's on the TikTok and Twitter, and the lyrics for it are on my website too. And then we have Edgar Allan Poe. I think everyone's heard of Edgar Allan Poe. But what is he famous for? Well, he had a poem called The Raven, which is maybe his most famous poem, and then he had some short stories that are very popular. And his thing is he liked short stories more than long stories. He preferred the short story over novels, and he was known to value a good short story over a long, boring novel. And he actually attacked a lot of writers during his day, attacked them for being boring, and he put a lot of focus on short stories. So short stories became very popular for a time because of him. And I used to try to write poetry and fantasy novels, but I found myself focusing more on poetry. And when I heard about this side of Edgar Allan Poe, I thought, well, maybe it's not a bad idea just to quit the fantasy novels or retell them as through poems and also do other poetry collections, and it can be okay, you know, not the end of the world. So I have one more person, Helen Keller, the bonus poet. So a lot of people don't know she wrote poetry. She's not a famous poet, but she does have a very powerful quote, which is, "Life is either a daring adventure or nothing at all." So I kind of live my life that way too. You want to take risks, you want to travel, you don't just want to do nothing, or you become nothing, essentially. We can think about it like this way: life is about living, not surviving. So that is the end. That's it. Thanks for watching. I just wrote my 1000th poem. I finished this presentation about it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm also going to edit it. I'll repost it on my TikTok channel and Twitter account in case you didn't see it, because I noticed more people just joined. And I do live poetry readings three days a week, usually 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I do it Sunday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then I also do travel videos the other days, Monday evening, 6 p.m. and Eastern Standard Time, and then Wednesday, or which day I do? Actually, Thursday, Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m. I do the shopping restaurants in China. So you can check that out, and thank you for joining in. I'll see you next time.